Back on the program now is Congresswoman Elise Stefanik, a Republican from New York 21. She serves on the Committee on Education and the Workforce. She's also chair of the House Republican Conference. And Congresswoman, it's good to have you back here.
Good to be with you, Guy.
I want to just start with the news breaking today about the presidential debates that have now been agreed to by both campaigns, at least two of them, one very early, coming up next month, and then one in September. I know Team Trump is asking for at least two or three more. Seems like Biden is probably going to stick with these two. I wasn't sure we were going to see any, quite frankly. Just your reaction to what has just been announced.
My reaction is President Trump has said he will debate anytime, anywhere against a beleaguered, failed president in Joe Biden that the American people see crumbling every single day. I think President Trump is in an incredibly strong position. You saw the recent polling that came out, Guy, about he is cleaning Joe Biden's clock in swing states like Georgia, Nevada, Michigan, as well as doing extremely well in Arizona and Pennsylvania. I think the map, in fact, will be expanded in some of these states that may go President Trump's way. So I think when it comes to the debates, the American people are going to see a very clear contrast of a fundamentally failed president in Joe Biden, whether it's the border crisis, whether it's Bidenflation, which is hurting hardworking families and is just crushing the economies and budgets of families every single week when they go to the grocery store, when they're balancing their checkbooks, looking at their bank accounts, versus the tremendous economic growth and wage growth we saw under President Trump, the secure border, the most secure border in our nation's history, and the peace around the world juxtaposed with under Joe Biden, just the chaos and our most precious ally, Israel, being under attack.
I want to come back to Israel in a moment, but since you mentioned inflation, we'll get more to the new numbers today, which were, again, bad. The president has now repeated a claim a few times in the last 2 weeks that he inherited 9% inflation. When he came into office, it was at 9%. Of course, it's not true. It was well under 2%, but here he was just yesterday in cut 12.
Inflation has gone slightly up. It was at 9% when I came in.
It was at 9% when I came in, he said. Almost the same debunked claim that he made on CNN last week. I mean, people, Congresswoman, I don't think buy this. They remember how things were before he took office. Why does he insist on saying something that's obviously, but just brazenly untrue? I've seen one theory being maybe he's talking about the inflation rate when he first got elected in like the 1970s. It's a bit of a head scratcher.
Well, it's offensive to the American people, Guy, because as you pointed out, people are smart. They understand how far their dollars went in President Trump's booming economy versus they understand how limited their dollars go in Joe Biden's Bidenflation economy. And this just shows a fundamental tone deafness about how people are struggling across this country. I am very connected every single day with my constituents, whether it's on issues like economic opportunity, whether it's on issues like grocery bills, whether it's on issues like national security issues. I just met with military families from my office. And people understand that the economy under Joe Biden has been catastrophic. And it reminds me, remember earlier this year, Guy, they announced they're going to run on Biden economics. And my pushback to that as the House Republican Conference Chair focused on messaging is let's talk about Biden economics because the American people see how painful it has been. So it shows that fundamental disconnect. And I think that's why you're seeing the poll numbers for President Trump continue to get stronger and stronger among independents, among voters generally, among Hispanic voters, black voters, and young voters as well.
Congresswoman, on the matter of Israel and the war in Gaza, we saw the president announce last week that he is going to withhold offensive weapons from the Israelis if they go into Rafah, which is the final stronghold of the Hamas terrorist fighting force. Also a report in the Washington Post that the Biden administration is offering to give Israel valuable intelligence about the, among other things, whereabouts of top leaders in Hamas if they don't go into Gaza the way that Biden's pressuring them not to, which raised questions about, are we actually withholding that kind of intel from a very close ally and hanging it over their heads to try to bully them into doing something in terms of their existential war effort? I know the White House has denied that report, but it was sourced by 4 people in the Washington Post. Then we saw last night, well, actually, they are going to give $1 billion of aid now to the Israelis. After all, unclear exactly what that entails, given the embargo that Biden has just announced. And then just minutes ago, our colleague here at Fox News, Aisha Hasni, reporting that over in the Senate, the majority leader, Chuck Schumer, New York Democrat, says he will not allow a vote on the House's Israel bill, which would force weapons into Israel. You guys just passed, on a wide bipartisan basis, more aid to Israel. Biden is now playing political games with that aid. Schumer won't even allow a vote on your bill from the House, really pressing Biden on this point, with Schumer saying, quote, "The president has already said he'd veto it, so it's not going anywhere," end quote. Your response to that breaking news coming from Senator Schumer?
My response is this is disgraceful, the lack of leadership we're seeing from the Democrat Party led by Joe Biden and Chuck Schumer in the Senate, where they have turned their backs on supporting our most precious ally, Israel, in a time of existential need. And let's take a step back, Guy. October 7th, the atrocities and terrorist attacks committed by Iranian-backed Hamas terrorists was the bloodiest day since the Holocaust. We must stand as Americans with Israel as they eradicate this terrorist threat that fundamentally doesn't believe Israel has a right to exist. So we fully stand by Israel using every tool they have and all of the military aid we passed, which was the intent of Congress to eradicate Hamas. I also serve on the House Intel Committee, Guy, and I can tell you that the next time I have those agencies as well as this administration in front of us in that committee, I will be demanding accountability, because if it turns out they're withholding intel for political purposes because Joe Biden's campaign is fledgling in Michigan, which is what this is really about, is Joe Biden's weakening campaign, that is threatening not only the national security of Israel, that's threatening our national security in the United States of America. It is unacceptable. It is disgraceful. And we all remember the Democrats' sham impeachment against President Trump about, quote unquote, withholding Ukrainian aid, which, by the way, that aid was released and sent to Ukraine. Yet here you have a Democrat president in Joe Biden illegally withholding aid that Congress voted on for his political benefits for his campaign because of his issues and because the Democrat Party base is so vehemently anti-Semitic and anti-Israel. It is a disgrace. We are proud of our strong vote in the House. We will be continuing to show strong leadership on a moral stage and on a national security stage where Chuck Schumer has failed.
You know, I'm just trying to make sense of what Biden's doing beyond the framing of electoral concerns, because I know that's a cynical way to look at it. I happen to believe it is the correct way to look at it, which I agree with you is absolutely disgraceful. But you look at what he's doing, where, you know, he'll give the speech on the Holocaust on Tuesday and of last week, then he'll come out and admit, oh, yes, we actually have paused these precision munitions to the Israelis because we're trying to pressure them over Rafah. Then they double down on that and they say, get out of Rafah, get out of Gaza altogether. If you go into Rafah, we're going to do an arms embargo on offensive weapons. And then yesterday, they're like, well, we're going to give $1 billion in weapons to Israel after all. They denied the intel story. It's just all over the map. And it feels like, you know, sometimes on any given day, they want to sort of burnish their pro-Israel bona fides. And then in order to placate a mob in their own base, the next day they do something else on the other side of the ledger. It's incoherent from a foreign policy standpoint. And it just, again, I don't know how you escape the conclusion that he's making these decisions and they're making these announcements, which seem to be at cross purposes all the time, to try to make one group of voters happy one day and then limit that damage with another group of voters the next day without really standing in the gap and taking a principled stand on something that ought to be pretty close to a black and white issue.
Well, I believe that they are doing this for political purposes, and you're right. That is you described it as a cynical view, but it's the realistic view. You talk and read in these articles that the White House essentially acknowledges that, maybe not on the record, but it is an acknowledged assumption that that is why they are doing these decisions, which is a reflection of today's Democrat Party, Guy, about how they have turned their backs on Israel. But at every opportunity to show leadership, Joe Biden has failed. Let's not forget, it's not just in the past 2 weeks. We saw multiple veto threats when we brought the Israel aid package to the floor. We saw the encouragement to have Dems vote against when we brought the suspension bill to pass the Israel aid package. You had Chuck Schumer, at the encouragement of Joe Biden in the White House, call for Bibi Netanyahu to be removed, meddling in Israeli elections as a time when they are very unified, focusing on prosecuting this war, as you said, for their very existence. So at every opportunity, Joe Biden has failed to lead on the world stage, and the world is watching, and the American people are watching. And there is a reason, as I said, why President Trump continues to do stronger and stronger in the polls, and Joe Biden continues to fail, and those polls get more and more abysmal. Because you compare it to where we were in terms of our national security position on the world stage. You had the Abraham Accords, historic peace breakthroughs in the Middle East. You had an incredibly strong partnership with Israel. You had significant reinvestment in our military capabilities. Our adversaries feared us, and our allies relied on us, and we are seeing the exact opposite in Joe Biden's administration. Let's also add that the Biden administration continues to be obsessed with appeasing Iran, a continuation of the failed Obama foreign policies, and that's an important part of this as well.
On a related note, I want to talk about the work that you and your colleagues have been doing on the Education Committee. We've seen you in particular really do a number on some of these presidential figures from various elite schools, two of whom I think you've grilled who are now out of those positions, and others just flailing. There's going to be another hearing coming up. We talked to your colleague Kevin Kiley about this recently. So May 23rd on Capitol Hill will be, I believe, the third round of these hearings, because there's a real anti-Semitism and terrorism problem, pro-terrorism problem on a lot of these campuses, and then just utter failures of leadership from administrators, people running scared, people just cowering before these throngs, these hordes of Hamas sympathizers and supporters, to the point that it's been extremely upsetting and disturbing, and worse, to Jewish students. I did notice that my alma mater, Northwestern, has been added now to the docket for May 23rd. Not originally supposed to be part of the program, but now Northwestern will be under the glare when that all happens. I wonder, what was it that made you guys decide to include Northwestern? I think, sadly, as a proud alum, I think it's necessary for some accountability. And what are you hoping to glean from President Schill when he comes before your committee?
Well, Northwestern has been one of the most egregious in terms of their mishandling of, they've refused to combat anti-Semitism. In the case of Northwestern, and this will come out over the course of the hearing, there have been negotiations with the leadership of Northwestern and the pro-Hamas mob, and they have failed to protect Jewish students on campus. So what it really is, Guy, is we've heard from so many Jewish students, individual experiences that are absolutely haunting and harrowing that they have faced on these campuses. And unfortunately, the only way we've forced these schools to take action is by holding them accountable, hauling them in front of Congress. And I will tell you, what we saw from most recently the Columbia president hearing is the posture of these university presidents is to just say whatever they have to get through the hearing. But when we followed up on Columbia, their lip service that they're addressing this is not backed up by their failure to act, their failure to protect Jewish students, their failure
it got worse.
It got worse. And it came out that what she said in front of Congress was not truthful when it came to some of the professors who she said were under investigation because of their pro-Hamas statements. Turns out they were not under investigation. So these are major oversight issues of taxpayer dollars on these campuses. And there's an important legal piece, which is why you're seeing multiple lawsuits being filed, including against Northwestern from Jewish students who have not been protected on campus. So as you know, Guy, I spend a lot of time preparing for these hearings, and Northwestern, the other schools that are being hauled in, I will be prepared to hold them accountable for their failures. And it set off a real earthquake. Over the years, I've been involved in a lot of high-profile hearings. This is more of an earthquake than any other high-profile hearing, and it's because of the moral bankruptcy that everyone sees in these university leaders. It's so far gone that we need to stand up on behalf of the American people and U.S. taxpayers to rein them back in.
Yeah, and to me, accountability also has to involve punishment for people who clearly break rules and laws. And that seems to be something that's lacking at a number of these schools, including Northwestern, where they'll say, oh, well, we saw this and there were some concerning violations and it's under investigation. And then you try to find a single example of actual meaningful ramifications for the people who violate the rules or the laws. And then you couple that with the negotiations and the concessions to these people, and you have the opposite of accountability. So, look, I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. I'm sure they have these presidents from these schools, including UCLA, Northwestern, and otherwise, watching the previous testimony from the other presidents to anticipate what kind of questions you might ask. And so I'm sure you are going to adjust for that accordingly. But I think there are some very important questions that have to be asked, and not just answered with platitudes and vagaries, but also like specifics, and see how under real important rhetorical fire these people can respond, if they can respond in a way that is meaningful, that is substantive, that is reassuring in any meaningful way. So I will be watching with great interest on May 23rd, and I look forward to seeing you ask the questions loaded for bear and very well prepared, I hope and I trust. Congresswoman Elise Stefanik of New York on The Guy Benson Show. Congresswoman, we thank you very much for your time. We'll talk again soon.
Thank you, Guy.